understand.
Deuce making slaps true.
I be doing shit these niggas wouldn't understand. Stop playing with that man. Where was niggas at when I ran through 200 bands? Stop playing with that man. Where was niggas at when they was trying to get a chair? Stop playing with that man. Where was niggas at when Walton wasn't playing fair? Yeah, stop playing with that man. Stop. Yeah, stop playing with that man. Stop it. Nigga, stop playing with that man. Shit, nigga. Stop playing with that man. Shit, nigga. Yeah, stop playing with that man. Nigga, we ain't playing around. Karate chop, nigga, that's gon' lay him down. I got it from my sensei. A Ku Klux, so I bought me 10Ks. My shooter got me, I made sure his rent paid. A grimy nigga, but he don't wear 10K. He wears Givenchy, he don't even fit J's. A sharpshooter, you should see him switchblade. I be doing shit these niggas wouldn't understand. Stop playing with that man. Where was niggas at when I ran through 200 bands? Stop playing with that man. Where was niggas at when they was trying to get a chair? Stop playing with that man. Where was niggas at when Walton wasn't playing fair? Yeah, stop playing with that man. Stop. Yeah, stop playing with that man. Stop it. Nigga, stop playing with that man. Shit, nigga. Stop playing with that man. Shit, nigga. Yeah, stop playing with that man. Add me on Twitter, that's gon' get you in the jam. Stop playing with that man. 2 to 3 shells and knock a nigga out his brain. Stop playing with that man. Ever been indicted, I ain't see you in that jam. Yeah, stop playing with that man. Niggas acting like fans. Some shit I never understand. Is you gangster or not? That's for Instagram, you don't hang on the block. This a hunt Diddy, I don't hang with no stocks. You a brand lover, bitch, you bang with the ops. You like felons cause I came with a lot. A tough cookie put his brains in a knot. How much I pay for these chains, it's a lot. Stop talking money if you really don't got it. I be doing shit these niggas wouldn't understand. Stop playing with that man. Where was niggas at when I ran through 200 bands? Stop playing with that man. Where was niggas at when they was trying to get a chair? Stop playing with that man. Where was niggas at when Walton wasn't playing fair? Yeah, stop playing with that man. Stop. Yeah, stop playing with that man. Stop it. Nigga, stop playing with that man. Shit, nigga. Stop playing with that man. Shit, nigga. Yeah, stop playing with that man. Stop playing with that man. Nigga already know what the deal is, nigga. Yeah, I should already know by now. Don't play with him. We're not the ones to play with. What is money? Don't make us throw it up in the air and walk away. Put a price on your head on a sticky pad. Stop playing. Stop playing with that man. Bitch, my life is Baghdad. Wolfing on the net, then he got stripper with his strap bag. 150 in a trash bag, time to shake him up. We tip the strippers, we strip the strippers. It's the mob, bitch, we killers. Beat it up, yeah, Thriller, Manila. Minx and bling, don't leave out the chinchillas. Double R, Rolls Royce down, you niggas know the deal with me. I'm a boss, never get robbed, niggas could only steal from me. But that's some 12-year-olds come out and drill from me. Think about it, do you want these problems literally? The Grim Reaper out and he don't show no sympathy. John Gotti car, mops in the yard, shoot for me. Nigga, I'm the Don in my city. Who is you and yours? Grab the beef packet and make top Roman noodles with it. If you ain't tryna get no money, who you do it for? John Gotti car, mops in the yard, shoot for me. Nigga, I'm the Don in my city. Who is you and yours? Grab the beef packet and make top Roman noodles with it. If you ain't tryna get no money, who you do it for? See a op in traffic, hit him up. Nigga, Tupac, the crime report in ballistics say he died from 2 blocks. I know he ran his mouth, but did you have to knock his shoes off? 40 with a dick, let it squeeze, it got blue balls. Heavy trippy red if he playing with my blue 166 shots, another 6 at Jimmy Neutron. I'm a demon time, don't you ever get too big headed. Beef on a plate, shrimp, lobster, steak, eat with me. Instead you worry about always trying to compete with me. Swimming with the fishes like he trying to find Nemo. A shark in the water, a great righty seafood. Dumbass spent his whole life trying to be Debo. 100 shells drop, cock back, mops, and reload. That Black Lives Matter shit is so 2003, bro. John Gotti car mops in the yard, shoot for me, nigga. I'm the Don in my city. Who is you and yours? Grab the beef packet and make top Roman noodles with it. If you ain't trying to get no money, who you do it for? John Gotti car mops in the yard, shoot for me, nigga. I'm the Don in my city. Who is you and yours? Grab the beef packet and make top Roman noodles with it. If you ain't trying to get no money, who you do it for? Nigga. John Gotti car mops in the yard, shoot for me, nigga, I'm the Don of my city, who is you and yours? Shit. Grab the beef packet and make top Roman noodles with it. Shit. John Gotti car mops in the yard, shoot for me. If you ain't tryna get no money, who you do it for?
We Japanese still. You getting cooked in front of your family like a Japanese meal. It's Yashup the Hibachi. Oh man, I messed my own intro up, man. We back, man. It's Yashup the Hibachi, and none of you niggas can stop me. But can't help but watch me. There we go. We back. We got it. We back, man. YAP Gang Historicity. YAP Gang Historical. Y'all already know how we rocking, man. Tonight we're gonna read about history of anti-Semitism. But before we get into my sources, I want to go to the United States Holocaust Memorial Museum. We're gonna read some material off their website, play the video, and you know what we do what we do best, and that's educate the people, man. Before we get started, I have one request of my viewers. Just one request.
Hi, everybody. Time to use your noggin. How do you use your noggin, you say? Well, here's how you use it every day. Use your noggin when you write a letter. Use your noggin when you make it better. Use your noggin when you play guitar. Use your noggin to spot a star. Use your noggin when you make a scene. Use your noggin when you mix up green. Use your noggin to play a game. When you use your noggin, it's never the same. Use your noggin to sing a song. Ask another noggin to sing along. Use your noggin with your computer. Hey, that's Z. What could be cuter? Use your noggin. That's what it's for.
I'm using my noggin.
Are you using yours?
We really got to use our noggin, man. So the only thing I ask and request of my audience is to use your noggin. There's a lot of confusion out there, a lot of idiocy, a lot of racism that can easily be combated, and we just got to do better, because what's happening right now with the Kyrie and the Kanye or Ye situation, rather, is a lot of people spewing hatred or justifying these racist, anti-Semitic stances. So it's my job to educate you guys on what anti-Semitism is, and also how it relates to racism towards Black people, and how the two are married together. Spoiler alert: we are going to be looking at Tudor Parfit's book Hybrid Hate, and that's what that book is actually doing. I know a lot of BHIs, they saw that book, they get excited, but don't even know. I remember on Sister E's channel, they had Mr. Parfit, PhD. They had him on the show, but did they actually read the Hybrid Hate book? Because the book is talking about how pretty much bringing to light and repudiating what people like We Woke Now, Sister E. Teo, BHIs in general do, which is castigate the Jewish people. But what he did in that book was to show that the same hatred that was for the Jewish people in Europe was the same hatred that African Americans and Africans alike were experiencing from Europeans. So if you actually tune into the book, That's the sentiment of the book Hybrid Hate. That's why it's called Hybrid Hate. So we will be touching on one of his chapters in there, I believe chapter 6, The Black and the Jew, where he explicitly states that, which it goes with the anti-Semitism and learning what that is. So we're going to open up with this because a lot of Black Hebrew Israelites are anti-Semites. A lot of Black Hebrew Israelites are actually Nazis are socialists, which is funny, nationalists. That's what the word Nazi means, national socialists. That's what it means. And pro-Black people in general. We exposed last show that Marcus Garvey actually espoused and also celebrated and venerated white supremacist Cox and white supremacist Plecker. Now, Plecker is from Plecker's List. Mr. Cox is known for his book, White America, which is a complete white supremacist book that denigrates Black people. And Marcus Garvey agreed, and actually supported their stances because the idea of racial superiority and racial inferiority he had no problems with. And many of these BHI groups and pro-Black groups that's on Sinetta, a lot of these people have the same stance of the Dixiecrats of the past, the Democrats of the past, very hateful, evil stance, and they base their analysis only on skin color, right? And that's also a trait of the Nazis, right? Which, shout out to Tudor Parfit, he brings that up in his book. The Nazis believe that culture, religion, characteristics, all of those things were pretty much married to your skin color, to how you look, to your quote-unquote race. And many Black Hebrew Israelites express that as well. Many pro-Black people express that as well. Oh, well, if a real Black person would do X, Y, and Z. Why do they talk like that? Because they have adopted this doctrine of racial essentialism, which they think that, all Black people do X, Y, and Z. All white people do X, Y, and Z. If you have a certain skin color or certain morphology, then you fall into these categories that we tie to those different racial groups. This is how the Nazis were thinking. And now you got Black Hebrew Israelites and you got pro-Black groups that are pretty much lockstep with these racial, very racial, evil ideologies. What you guys are going to learn is not how people try to frame it, this white versus Black. We're dealing with ideologues. The ideologues are the problem. The ideologies are the problem. This idea concept that your morphology and your skin color determines your ancestry, your morphology and your skin color determines your characteristics, and this determines your religion, determines your culture, is all BS and hogwash point of views used to push white supremacist or race superiority narratives. That's all it's used for. And it's 2022. It's time to flush this 19, 18, and 17th century garbage down the drain. But Black Hebrew Israelite cults don't want to give this up. Pro-Black groups don't want to give this up. They want to continue to push these things. Many of these groups are lockstep with the white supremacists and rednecks of the past. This is why Thomas Sowell spent time to actually write his book, Black Rednecks and White Liberals, because many of the ways that we have learned, many of the ways and characteristics that we have in America come from these rednecks, from our voting habits to our eating habits. A lot of these things we picked up from them, saying things like chitlins, that comes from them, voting Democrat, that comes from them, trying to turn abortion or eugenics into a good thing, trying to say it's actually good for you. Oh, it's actually good for you. This is what they would tell us. This is how they would sell and peddle abortion to Black people. Back then, they would say, actually, we're trying to do you a favor. And now that's what's going on today. So we could go on and on and on, how we picked up their calling each other coons. That comes from them. You understand? We get a lot. Ebonics. Comes from rednecks, man. A lot of our negative attributes were absorbed and adopted from the rednecks of the South, the Dixiecrats and Democrats of the South. And that's just the reality of the fact. And another thing we have picked up is anti-Semitism. So tonight we're going to deal with what is anti-Semitism. Some people are confused on the actual term. The term was coined in the 19th century. Okay, that's when it was coined, and it was a specific. It had a specific meaning, and connotation. I know a lot of people. They'll say, "How can I be anti-Semite if I myself am claiming that I'm from Shem?" Well, that's not actually how the anti-Semite thing works. Yes, I understand that logically, if you believe that Shem existed, then you believe he had descendants, and you were one of those descendants, then you will be a Shemite. I understand that, but anti-Semite has its own meaning that is really honed in on the Jews of Europe at that time, and we're going to break that down here on the show tonight, so we can actually educate our people. Not just preach to them. Again, preach just means to proclaim. We're not here to proclaim anything. We're about to show and prove. And I believe the United States Holocaust Memorial Museum does a great job at doing that. And of course, I'm going to be giving my own sources to bolster this. So anyway, with no further ado, let's get right into the meat and potatoes of tonight's presentation. All right, so right here, as you can see, United States Holocaust Memorial Museum. .org or USHMM.org. And it's written here, what is anti-Semitism? Why the Jews? History of anti-Semitism. So we're going to watch this clip. But before we watch the clip, let's get right to it. So as you guys can see, it has a list of discussing questions. But what we want to learn here is anti-Semitism. The term anti-Semitism was coined only in the 19th century, but anti-Jewish hatred and Judeophobia, fear of Jews, date back to the ancient times and have a variety of causes. So we have to understand that this term is new. But the actual hatred for Jews, of course, is older. But the actual term, because a lot of questions are posed to this channel and posed to other people. What does it mean to be anti-Semite? And you have to understand this. You have to understand the history of the Nazis. So again, right here, it gives you history of the Nazi Party, anti-Semitism in history. Let's see, where do I want to start? I want to go straight to the person who coined the term. Oh, right here, origin and meaning of the term. The word anti-Semitism means prejudice against or hatred of Jews. The Holocaust, state-sponsored persecution and murder of European Jews by Nazi Germany and its collaborators between 1933 and 1945, is history's most extreme example of anti-Semitism. In 1879, German journalist Wilhelm Marr originated the term anti-Semitism. So that's where we get anti-Semitism from, is Wilhelm Marr. It is in 1879, because a lot of people try to give their own origin to this word or their own meaning to the word. It has, the connotation have changed over years, but the origin is traced back to this German journalist, Wilhelm Marr. Germany has seemed to be like a hotbed of what you call hate speech or racial thinking, because again, the racial thinking came from Blumenbach and his constituents. They came up with this idea of black, white, and sticking these people in these boxes scientifically, pseudoscientifically. And then you see this pop up out in Germany as well. It says, denoting the hatred of Jews and also the hatred of various liberal, cosmopolitan, and international political trends of the 18th and 19th century. So nowadays, what you have is people saying, "Oh, they're using the term you're an anti-Semite, you're anti-Semite," but actually, they use that to try to, tell someone that they're committing this act. But initially, it was used by Germans. The Germans themselves called themselves anti-Semite. They started a party or a group called Anti-Semites. They are the ones who coined it and started calling themselves this, right? It says, often associated with Jews, the trends under attack included equal civil rights, constitutional democracy, free trade, socialism, finance capitalism, and pacifism. And the reason why you see finance capitalism, free trade, stuff like that, because they associate the Jews with capitalism. Even Hitler would equate Jews with capitalism because they were successful in certain sectors of business. Anti-Semitism in history. The specific hatred of Jews, however, preceded the modern era and the coining of the term anti-Semitism. Among the most common manifestations of anti-Semitism throughout history were pogroms, violent violence launched against Jews, and frequently encouraged by government authorities. So all these things that was happening in medieval Europe, the persecution towards Jews, these things were state sanctions. A state-sponsored, state-sanctioned to actually, commit these violent acts towards Jews. It says pogroms were often incited by blood libels, false rumors that Jews used the blood of Christian children for ritual purposes. And the same, we read last week, or Saturday rather, that, racist whites would use excuses to lynch us. And one of their main excuses their main go-to was rape. They would incite rape to lynch black men. They would invoke rape, They would invoke rape as a reason to keep lynching on the law books and a justification of lynching black people because of rape. It's the same thing with abortion. I made the analog last week. They do this with abortion. They say, we need abortions because of rape. But rape is only 1% of all abortions, less than 1% of all abortions. So it's not as big as these people try to make it. And the end doesn't justify the means. But this is the same excuse that these Dixiecrats and Democrats were using back then. And this is similar in a similar vein. In Europe, you have these people spreading these rumors about Jews in order to, commit acts of violence on them. And the same thing went on with African Americans here in America. It says right here, in modern era, anti-Semites added a political dimension to their ideology of hatred. In the last third of the 19th century, anti-Semitic political parties were formed in Germany, France, and Austria. Publications such as the Protocols of the Elder of Zion generated or provided support for fraudulent theories of an international Jewish conspiracy. A potent component of political anti-Semitism was nationalism, whose adherents often falsely denounced Jews as disloyal citizens. The 19th century xenophobic the Volk movement, or folk or people's movement, made up of German philosophers, scholars, and artists who viewed the Jewish spirit as alien to Germandom, shaped the notion of the Jew as a non-German. Theorists of racial anthropology provided pseudoscientific backing for this idea. And we always highlight this pseudoscientific backing. Even before this period, with Blumenbach and his constituents, they came up with these ideas about race and putting these people in these racial categories and racial boxes. And then the Nazis just amplified that by saying, hey, if you fit in these racial boxes, then your culture and your religion is there with you inherently. There's nothing you can do to change that, even though that's pseudoscience, because we know you learn culture and history and language while you're living on the earth. You don't get that in the womb. That has nothing to do with your autosomes or your chromosomes. It's not nothing you inherit from your mother and your father biologically. That's something you're taught. Culture, religion, your behaviors, your mannerisms, you get that while you're living. That's why if I took you, the viewer, right, whether you're black, white, Spanish, whatever, if I took you and I placed you in China and you had children in China, and then you had subsequent generations after you, your children are going to be thoroughly, Chinese, culturally, and probably religion-wise, because they're going to adopt and absorb the people around them. That has nothing to do with biology. That has everything to do with your social environment, your social atmosphere. Your social climate plays into that. But these pseudoscientific groups were using these ideas to push their radical agendas and eugenics and genocide, and pretty much demarcating large swaths of people. The beginning of Nazi anti-Semitism, the Nazi Party, again, which is a contraption or conjunction of Nazi and socialist, or a nationalist and socialist. Nationalist Socialist Party is what Nazi means. The Nazi Party, founded in 1919 and led by Adolf Hitler, gave a political expression to theories of racism. In part, the Nazi Party gained popularity by disseminating anti-Jewish propaganda. Millions brought Hitler's Mein Kampf, which means my struggle, which called for the removal of Jews from Germany. And all of these ideals, these ideologies like anti-Semitism or racism, they always have some kind of underlying theme or goal, right? And the goal here was to get the Jews from Germany. The goal here in America was to keep blacks. White supremacy's goal was to keep Black Americans below the white man, no matter what the skill set was, no matter the level of intelligence of that Black American, no matter his achievements. Just keep him below what we call white Americans, simply by the fact of this, by virtue of his skin color. So these things were a mechanism to keep people down or remove people or, justify acts of violence. As we know, the Jews were persecuted and killed in Nazi Germany. It says anti-Semitism oral history excerpt. So before I play this, I want to let everybody know that I am covered under the fair use. Section 107 of the Copyright Act provides a statutory framework for determining whether something is a fair use and identifies certain types of uses, such as criticism, commentary, news reporting, teaching, scholarship, and research. So we will be doing a lot of teaching, using this for teaching and scholarship and research purposes. So we are well covered under the fair use, Section 107 of the Copyright Act. All right, let's see if we can get this video to play.
One of my other memories is the boycott of April 1933, where our show windows were plastered with Jew, don't go to the Jew, and so on and so forth. These are really some of my childhood memories. Family life was great. Outside the family, it was not so good. You were insulted in the street many times. You were called dirty Jew. Things like that. For several years, I did have Gentile girlfriends. And of course, under the pressure of the Nazi time, they could no longer associate with me. And I would not dare associate with them.
So yeah, that's very straightforward and to the point. She remembers the discrimination that she felt in Nazi Germany. It says here, Haynes' family owned a photographic studio in 1940. She and other family members were deported to the Gurs camp in southern France. In September 1941, the Children's Aid Society, OSE, rescued Han, and she hid in the children's home in Les Chambon-sur-Léon. Her mother perished at Auschwitz. In 1943, Han obtained false papers and crossed into Switzerland. She married in Geneva in 1945, had a daughter in 1946. In 1948, she arrived in the United States. So let's continue reading here about the Nazis. It says, with the Nazi rise to power in 1933, the party ordered anti-Jewish economic boycotts, staged book burnings, and enacted discriminatory anti-Jewish legislation. We dealt with this in America, and it should sound very familiar if you're familiar with Black American history. What we dealt with the KKK, we dealt with the separate but equal, the Dred Scott decision. A lot of the things we were fighting against were done through the court system, through the laws, right? The legislation and legislatures were our enemies, right? I mean, these people were Democrats. Many of these people represent the left side of politics. And the funny thing is, the Nazis represent the left side of politics. But just like just like Jews, African Americans in America vote for the same political parties that cause harm to their ancestors. that put these racist laws into into effect. The anti-Jewish legislation that's from the Nazi Socialist Party. These people are leftists. You understand? The anti-black or the black codes, the Jim Crow laws were put into law by the Democrats. They are on the left. But today we show our, we show the most support out of any other groups, Jews and blacks, for Democrats and the left than any other group. It's like 90% African Americans vote Democrat. And then you got, I think the Jews like 70 or 80%. American Jews vote Democrat. And it just blows my mind because when you know the history, understand the history, that side of the political spectrum is the one who did the most harm to you historically. All right, so it says in 1935, the Nuremberg laws racially defined Jews by blood and ordered the total separation of so-called Aryans and non-Aryans, thereby legalizing a racist hierarchy. Right? This is coming from the concept of race. This is where this is coming from. This is why when the Nazis fell, you start seeing overt racism start to die out. Because, the world was like, oh, wait a minute, we're taking this race stuff too far. Well, we're taking these people, cascading these people and putting them in gas chambers, right? Let's keep reading. It says, on the night, hold on, let's read this. Nazi anti-Jewish boycott. So that's what we were reading earlier in 1933. It says, soon after the Nazis assumed power in Germany, they launched a campaign to deprive Jews of their places in society. The effort began with an organized boycott of Jewish-owned businesses. Gangs arrested Jews, painted Jews forbidden onto shop windows, chanted anti-Semitic slogans, and blocked store entrances. All right, this is an old film, so there's no audio. All right, y'all get the point. Let's keep reading. It says, on the night of November 9th, 1938, the Nazis destroyed synagogues and the shop windows of Jewish-owned stores throughout Germany and Austria, an event known as the pogrom, Crystal Knot pogrom, or Night of Broken Glass. This event marked a transition to an era of destruction in which genocide will become the singular focus of Nazi anti-Semitism. And we won't play that because I believe it's all in German. All right, so let's play this clip, and then we're going to get into the sources for tonight. All right.
Between 1939 and 1945, the Nazis killed about 6 million Jews and millions of other civilians throughout Europe. These are some who were slaughtered in the Holocaust. A generation lost forever. Jews are the people of the Hebrew Bible who lived in a land now known as Israel. They believe that there is only one God. Christianity emerged from Judaism. Jesus of Nazareth was a Jew who preached a singular religious message. The first Christians were Jews who prayed in Hebrew and observed the customs and religious rituals of Judaism. The Last Supper was a Jewish religious meal, probably at Passover. Jesus was put to death at the hands of Roman authorities under Pontius Pilate in Judea, but the gospel accounts were interpreted as blaming all Jews for the crucifixion. To his followers, Jesus was the Christ, the Messiah. His death, sacrificial atonement. Most Jews believed the Messiah had not yet come. Redemption was not at hand. Soon after the crucifixion, Roman armies destroyed the temple in Jerusalem. Jews were exiled and scattered to live as a dispersed minority. By the 5th century, Christianity had become the dominant religion in the Roman Empire. The early Christian church portrayed Jews as unwilling to accept the word of God. Illuminations showed Satan binding the eyes of the Jews. Some church leaders intensified the charge, condemning Jews as agents of the devil and murderers of God. The accusation was not renounced until the 1960s, when the Second Vatican Council officially repudiated the ancient charge that Jews had murdered Christ. For centuries, state and church laws restricted Jews, preventing them from owning land and holding public office. Guilds excluded Jews from most occupations, forcing them into pursuits like moneylending, trade, commerce.
We covered that before. So we're forcing them into money lending and trade and commerce, and that's all they can do because you're blocking them out of other sectors of commerce or sectors of business. Then of course they're gonna get very, very good at money lending, trading, and commerce. Even in the Islamist regimes, they didn't believe that they could associate themselves with gold. So then, you had Jews being able to associate themselves with gold, right? So they narrowed down what actual careers and trades they can get into, and they got really good at it, which backfired on them again because they used that against them historically, right?
Excluded from Christian society, Jews maintained their religious and social customs. In 1095, Pope Urban II called for the liberation of Jerusalem. Christian crusaders set off to free the Holy Land from the Muslims. On the way, they slaughtered thousands of Jews. Throughout the Middle Ages, Christians persecuted Jews. Portrayed as alien, Jews were regarded as usurers. It was said Jews poisoned the wells of Europe, causing the Black Plague. Illustrations depicted Jews as the devil, with horns and cloven feet, and showed them using the blood of Christian children in ritual sacrifices. These lies came to be taken as truth. But where they were needed, Jews were tolerated. When they were allowed to participate in the larger society, Jews thrived. In many places, secular and religious states forced Jews into segregated districts later called ghettos. England, France, Spain, Portugal, and many German states expelled masses of Jews, most of whom migrated eastward, taking with them their religious convictions and traditions. In 1517, Martin Luther attacked the Pope and corruption within his own Roman Catholic Church, beginning the Protestant Reformation. The young Luther hoped that tolerance would persuade Jews to convert. But when Jews adhered to their own religious beliefs and refused to join his new Reformed Church, Luther's disappointment turned to hatred. What then shall we Christians do with this rejected and condemned people, the Jews? Their synagogues should be set on fire, and what does not burn must be covered over with earth, so that no man will ever see stone or cinder of them again. Their houses also should be razed and destroyed. All their prayer books should be taken from them. The Protestant Reformation brought no end to the anti-Jewish tradition of Christianity. With the 18th century Enlightenment's emphasis on reason, the domination of the Church diminished. Some Enlightenment thinkers called for full rights for Jews, but only on the condition that they discard their religious customs. Others blamed Judaism as the source of irrational religious faith. Even though many Jews assimilated socially and culturally, prejudice did not disappear. In France in 1894, Captain Alfred Dreyfus, the only Jewish member of the French Army's general staff, was convicted of passing military secrets to Germany. Later, proof of forgery confirmed his innocence, but Dreyfus remained the victim of a cover-up to divert attention from Army corruption. A century after the French Revolution proclaimed liberty, equality, and fraternity, giving Jews their freedom, frenzied mobs in the streets of Paris chanted, "Death to the Jews." Religious discrimination had gradually changed into a thriving secular, political, and social anti-Semitism. Nevertheless, freed from some restrictions, many Jews entered the Christian world and became prominent citizens.
I just want to note here because somebody made a joke about they said this is the same shit they gonna make Kyrie watch probably. The other guy told him to go to the Holocaust Museum. But all jokes aside, like most people don't know this, so it's good to do a refresher course for us, but also for people that don't know this history. That so a lot of these BHIs don't know anything outside of Deuteronomy chapter 28 first. So we got to take our time out and share clips like this. But the point I was going to make is this is real anti-Semitism where they're actually getting laws enacted to prevent their wealth accruement, the ability to obtain wealth, actually getting their lives put in danger and stuff like that. Now we do know Jews get attacked. They say in New York, 50% of the hate crimes are towards Jews. No one's discounting that. But Kyrie sharing a movie is not anti-Semitism. The movie itself is anti-Semitism because within the movie, there are several claims that Jews are fake, not real, that Jews are Khazars, Edomites, a lot of disparaging things. So the movie itself is true anti-Semitism in that regard, but Kyrie just sharing the movie isn't. So I will always disagree with that. And the level that the ADL and the other constituents are taking it is just ridiculous. They themselves need to sit back and learn the history of anti-Semites. And that's why I'm taking my time out to teach what this actually is, who coined it. Wilhelm Moore coined the term, and it was a party affiliation that was made to state two things. One, you can't hide behind your religion, and two, you're a racist Semite. Therefore, I'm anti-Semite. The Germans will call themselves anti-Semite. All right. But anyway, this back to the clip. I want to finish this clip, and then we're going to get into some sources. All right. I don't know nothing about if he said he's retiring. I hope he doesn't throw his wealth away to appease some internet pundits.
Citizens, Then, around 1900, a new lie was promoted, that Jews conspired to dominate the world using their money and intelligence to manipulate trusting Christians. Russian secret police forged a document to support the story of a takeover plot supposedly authored by a conference of Jewish leaders. A proven forgery, the Protocols of the Elders of Zion, was nevertheless translated into every major language and distributed worldwide. It is circulated even today, despite indisputable proof that it is a fake. To divert popular discontent at appalling living conditions and autocratic control, Russian authorities encouraged anti-Semitic violence. Jews were blamed for the assassination of Tsar Alexander II in 1881. Pogroms, murderous rampages against Jews, erupted in Russia many times during the next 3 decades. The second half of the 19th century saw the emergence of yet another kind of anti-Semitism. At its core was the theory that Jews were not merely a religious group, but a separate race, Semites, set apart because of genetically inherited characteristics.
So when people say anti-Semitism is geared towards the religion, no, that's not what anti-Semitism and anti-Semitism movement was about. Like I said, it did two things. It said you can't hide behind your religion, and secondly, it's your race. It's immutable. It can't change. So since it can't change, we're going to do all these extreme things to you. Again, it's a mechanism to remove people you don't like, denigrate people you don't like, and put them below you. That's why it's so disgusting for people like Marcus Garvey to side with people like Cox and Plecker, which use white supremacy to do the same thing for African Americans, right? So these things are just glaringly obvious for anyone that's studied, right?
Anti-Semites believed racial characteristics could not be overcome by assimilation or even conversion.
You see that? This is anti-Semitism. This is what they taught. They believe. Look, you can convert all you want. You can be, because that's what was the thing of the old. So you can have your secret Jews or whatnot, your conversos. All they had to do is just convert to Christianity and stop practicing the religion of Judaism or whatever sect of Judaism they came from, right? Except car rights. For some weird reason, they had an exception, and they, other Jews would call them the Nazi Jews, and that's a whole different topic. But what they did was, essentially with this anti-Semite movement, was infuse it with the racial hierarchy arguments that they were having, the racial purity arguments that they were having about the Aryan race. That's where Iran gets its name from, Aryan, the white Aryan race. And they said the Jews are not a part of that. Hitler called them Negro parasites, and they cannot do anything to change that. They can't just assimilate into Germans. They'll never be true Germans, no matter what, because it's immutable. And this is what we teach today about Black and white people in these racial categories. We try to act as if just because you fit into this social caste system, that there are certain things about you that are immutable. Your culture, your religion, your characteristics, mannerisms, all those things. All right. So this is the idiocy that comes with this racial thinking. And this is the history of this over racialized thinking and racial categories that many of African Americans hold on to and don't want to let go. The word Black and the Black categorization has become a sacrament in the African American community, even though it has a very negative and destructive history in association with African Americans. That's the irony. It's like we vote Democrat when the Democrats have a very negative and destructive, history when it comes to the African American peoples and to the Jewish people. Because the person who coined anti-Semite, he came to the Americas and he joined the Democrats. He was a Democrat himself because he believed in racial hierarchy, white supremacy. He believed in those things. The Germans and the racist Americans were bouncing ideas off each other. FDR, he loved Mussolini, and his people in his cabinet went out and sat down with Nazis in America. We read that this Saturday. Woodrow Wilson believed in racial superiority, white supremacy. It's the same ideologue. The issues is not people groups, it's ideologues. And we've been taught and trained in these cults like BHI and these pro-black groups, Umar Johnson, the idiot, to think as groups and not ideologue. The ideologue is the problem. The ideology is the problem. You must eradicate the ideology. But many of you guys are in bed with racists because you yourself are a racist. That's why you have no problem with anti-Semitism. It's just another form of racism. All right, we're going to let it play. As you said, let me go back a little bit so you can hear us say it again.
Theory that Jews were not merely a religious group, but a separate race, Semites, set apart because of genetically inherited characteristics.
I'm sorry. Again, when they invoke this term anti-Semite, it is talking about racially, not religiously. Racially, that's what it was used for in the 19th century. That's when it was coined. It was designed to do that, to incorporate the racial hierarchy system and use it to say what? Every time you see racial hierarchy systems put into place, it's utilized to push supremacy, racial superiority and supremacy over someone else and keep them down, keep them out of job markets, keep them from accruing wealth, remove them, treat them badly, and enact harsh, violent acts against them. As we've seen with the KKK, we've seen with the segregationists, the white militias of the South, the same thing we see with the pogroms and we see with the Nazis in Europe and in Germany. They say it's your race. Your race is who you are. It's your skin color. It's the people you belong to. That's the problem. It's immutable. This is how they utilize anti-Semitism. And it's important that we're clear on that and we educate people on this, because the way people use it today, it's the same thing with Black Americans when they try to call everything systemic racism. No. You don't know what systemic racism is. Real systemic racism is like what we saw with the Dred Scott decision. That's systemic racism. When legislatures are involved and they're passing laws to discriminate against you based on your quote-unquote race or your skin color. Separate but equal laws, Jim Crow, black codes. That was systemic racism. And we could even argue that the New Deal was systemic racism because they purposely did not allow funding to go to people that was in agriculture. Why is that? How can that be deemed systemic racism? Because our people overrepresented agriculture during that time, effectively pushing us out and leaving us out to dry during the Great Depression. Redlining comes from FDR and the New Deal. All right?
Anti-Semites believed racial characteristics could not be overcome by assimilation or even conversion. Jews were said to be dangerous and threatening because of their, quote, Jewish blood. Anti-Semitic racism united pseudo-scientific theories with centuries-old anti-Jewish stereotypes. These ideas gained wide acceptance. The devastation of World War I, the demeaning peace of Versailles, the hyperinflation of the 1920s and the Depression of 1929 fueled mass discontent. The presence of Jews in German cultural, economic, and political life made them convenient scapegoats for Germany's misfortunes. Enter Adolf Hitler. Hitler viewed world history as a racial struggle for survival of the fittest. He saw Jews as the source of all evil: disease, social injustice, cultural decline, capitalism, and all forms of Marxism, especially communism. Anti-Semitism would become the predominant ideology of the Third Reich.
Zu einem Kampfziel erhoben, endlich diese Erscheinung aus dem deutschen Leben beseitigt sein wird.
Nazi racism victimized many groups of people, but it was against the Jews that the Nazi state mobilized all its resources for terror. After the Nazi takeover of power, anti-Jewish measures were put into effect one after another. Jewish businesses were boycotted, then seized. Jews were defined, separated from non-Jews. Jews were excluded from professions and studies. Jewish children were barred from schools. Jews were subjected to public humiliation. The changes, whether gradual or sudden, were incomprehensible. Few could imagine what would happen, even Jews. The Nazis took anti-Semitism to an unprecedented level of violence. Genocide, the systematic murder of millions of people deemed inferior. "6 million Jews. These are some of them.
All right, I think that's the clip. Well, you gotta hear that part. This hatred even often echoes the same falsehoods used by Nazis. Efforts to distort or deny Holocaust are among the ways that anti-Semitism is currently expressed. You know what's funny about that? The other day we was watching, and a brother said something about, oh, the Holocaust didn't happen with this many people, or whatever. I mean, that's anti-Semitism. So you can't get mad when people call you out on that. But then again, when I call you guys racist, y'all get mad at that too. So, hey, if the shoe fits, wear it. You understand? All right. So from there, that's the end of that right there. But there is a source I want to show you guys. Wilhelm Mayer, the one who actually coined the term anti-Semite, which he wants to pretty much undo Jews from pretty much being equal and having rights and stuff like that. He wants to undo that. All right, so let me see if I can find a quick source on this. I know there was a book that was talking about it when he came to the Americas. Then we're going to go into the sources that I have for you guys tonight so we can educate and edify. Let's see, comprehending and confronting anti-Semitism. I think it's this one, the patriarch anti-Semitism. I might be wrong. Oh, this is only 22 pages too, just like the one we read. No, it's not. So in this book, let me see if I can find it in the preview. If not, I'll just drop it. Right here, page 43. As you guys can see, hold on. Let me see if I can get straight to it in the preview. Right here. Boom. Real quick. Show you that he was a Democrat. Then I'm going to show you how many people support how the Jews support Democrats just like blacks support Democrats, even though they had this terrible history with this political party. It says right here, let's start up here. It says a balanced counterattack by a Jew was nevertheless published. The satirist Julius Seitenheim, editorial journal Westman Wasp, who had learned his craft as a writer for Mars newspaper, later gained fame in Berlin, attacked Mar in a pamphlet bearing The Jew Eater. The 4-page pamphlet portrays Mar both in caricature and written text, but even Seitenheim as a Jew does not take Der Judenspiegel very seriously. My dear Wilhelm, if you think that you can harm even one Jew with this weapon of yours, you lost your marbles. Close quote. This was apparently the prevalent opinion among Hamburg Jews. No real harm would come from this essay. It should be regarded as an intervention in internal Jewish controversy, as a mirror of the controversy to non-Jewish eyes, and no more than that. It's interesting that neither this controversy nor Mars' anti-Semitic attack in 1879 caused a break in the friendly relationship between Mars and Stettenheim. It is therefore not surprising that this essay of Mars was also important to his political affiliation as a Democrat, arousing sharp responses specifically from the Democratic Party. So this guy was definitely a Democrat when he came to the Americas as society went on, which makes sense because when you look at the Democrats historically, they supported racial hierarchy, they supported racial essentialism. You understand? They supported all those things, and today they these people these people known as the Jews in America vote overwhelmingly Democrat. It says right here, indeed, the practical consequences of the controversy surrounding Mar during his months in Hamburg were directly connected to his political activity as a Democrat. So this man definitely is a Democrat. So let's go to the Pew Research. Pew Research. Well, I keep telling y'all, this is all about ideology and ideologues. That's the issue. If anybody has the doctrine of racism, anti-Semitism, like that's the issue. We have to eradicate that. Jews, let me just type this in. American Jews, Democrats, see what happens. There it is. U.S. Jews, political affiliation, party excuse me, I can't get no words out tonight. Right here. Jewish Americans in 2020. Maybe this is a good one. Let me see if this is a good one here. Let me hard search this. All right, so I'll just go straight to the nitty gritty on that one. So this book here is entitled Wilhelm Marr. Go to the title card. Right here. Wilhelm Marr, the Patriarch of Anti-Semitism. By Moshe Zimmerman and others, right? Oh, well, the Jerusalem Moshe Zimmerman Hebrew University. He documented that this guy was actually a Democrat. But here's the funny thing. The person created anti-Semitism had all this hate and vitriol for Jews. The American Jews still vote Democrat, just like black Americans do. They don't do it at the 90%, but they do it at the 70%, which is beyond me. So this is the Pew Research Center. And it says here, politically, U.S. Jews on the whole tilt strongly liberal and tend to support the Democratic Party. When a new survey was fielded from late fall 2019 through late spring 2020, 71% said they were Democrats or lean Democratic. Among Jews of no religion, roughly 3/4 were Democrats or lean that way. So most of the secular Jews are Democrats, and most of Jews in general are Democrats. And again, they're the ones, the left are the ones who pretty much had the state-sponsored violence towards them. And yet politically they vote for these guys. It says, but Orthodox Jews have been trending in the opposite direction, becoming solidly Republican as non-Orthodox Jews are solidly Democratic. So 75% of Orthodox Jews are Republicans, or lean Republicans, compared to 57% in 2013. And 86% of Orthodox Jews rated then President Donald Trump handling a policy toward Israel as excellent or good, while majority of U.S. Jews described it as only fair or poor. Because, again, majority of them vote Democrat. It's just this weird theme that blacks and Jews share. We vote for the party of the demise. So with that, let's go to the books. Let's bring the books up. So I'm going to be dealing with, I believe, hybrid hate. And we won't be too long, hopefully. We can get in, accomplish our mission, and get out, right? So this is Hybrid Hate to the Prophet, Conflations of Anti-Semitism and Anti-Black Racism is the title of the book, and we're at page 155. So we're going to read this entire chapter here. And I believe it's very important that I do so. So we learn that Wilhelm Marr is the person who coined anti-Semitism. He wanted to start like a party and a movement to really undo the rights of the Jews, which is very similar to African-American history. Here in America, you had the Democrats do everything in their power to try to undo the rights of Africans post-slavery, right? And the reason why we fought the Civil War is to abolish slavery. Don't listen to these Democrat lies. It's Woodrow Wilson lie that it had nothing to do with Africans being free and everything to do with the industrial religion. That is a damn Democrat racist lie cooked up by your boy Woodrow Wilson. But then again, most of the African Americans, BHIs, you guys are the spiritual children of these people because you agree with them and you're lockstep with their ideology. You guys agree with anti-miscegenation laws. That's racist. Y'all believe in segregation. That's racist. When Ida B. Wells went to Woodrow Wilson, she told him this is not fair that you're segregating us, right? And he said, no, this is good for you. Woodrow Wilson responded, said, no, this is good for you. I'm doing this for your benefit. Now you got people in 2022 saying, oh, it's good that we should go back to segregation. So why was our forefathers fighting, our ancestors fighting so hard to end segregation? Y'all don't read and study history. Y'all don't even know what happened during that time. Right? Y'all want to go back to, unequal treatment? Y'all want to go back to black codes? Y'all want to go to Jim Crow? You want to go back to those days? This is weird. You guys are the spiritual children of Woodrow Wilson. Plecker, Cox, and this idea of white America. You guys are in agreement with that. But anyway, let's get to this chapter as a culmination. We're gonna tie it up in a nice little bow here, so you guys understand anti-Semitism now. From well, you should. Let me say that like that. So let's open this back up. Let me drop this window down. Boom. Let's open the source up. Y'all know how we rocking, man. We actually read over here. Pro-literacy here. We're pro-literacy. And I recommend, brothers and sisters read more. So boom. All right, so here's the page here. There's the book here, Hybrid Hate, again, covered under fair use. Section 107, we're going to be doing this for scholarship and learning education purposes, research purposes. So chapter 8 is titled Black/Jew. Sander Gilman, the leading scholar of Gentile attitudes towards the Jew's body, the title of one of his best-known books, published in 1991, perhaps overstated it when he wrote that the open quote general consensus of the ethnological literature was that Jews were black, or at least swarthy, close quote. The perceived color of Jews in 18th and 19th centuries, as it had been in the medieval period, was in fact controversial and unstable. And there really was no widely held consensus. Jewish color was entirely in the eye of the beholder. The Zionist leader and sociologist Arthur Rupin, writing in 1904, like many race experts, did not see a dark color as racial features of Jews or a racial issue at all. Open quote. The one really important race distinction, skin color, close quote, he wrote, open quote, a distinction which often calls up a deep-seated instinctive antipathy, does not enter into the question between Jews and Europeans, close quote. Indeed, as we have seen for a whole range of anthropological and racial theories, it was essential that Jews be regarded as white. Polygenists needed to prove the immutability of the Jewish race, and they did by often pointing to the famously white Jews of Cochin. Similarly, so hold on real quick before I move on. What does that do with anti-Semitism? We won't get to it, but also want to note here of how they only pointed to the white Jews of Cochin when you know there was black Jews there too. What I find with a lot of BHI channels, what they do the opposite. They only point to the black ones and don't point to the white ones. Why? Because they have racial essentialism in their mind. They have racial hierarchy in their mind. That's why you have certain people say, "Oh, these are the Ish people you're talking about, the Ish people," and they speak about these people in a disparaging manner. Same thing was going on back then for the opposite side, right? It says similarly for many of the monogenists, it was equally vital that European Jews be perceived as white in order that the effects of climate determinism be perceived in the black Jews of Luango, India, the Jordan Valley, Ethiopia, the Sahara, and elsewhere. So there are actual black Jews in Luango, India, Jordan Valley, which is in Israel, right? Ethiopia, the Sahara, and elsewhere. So if the Jews were in fact white, at least in Europe, and if this white Jew could be changed into a black Indian, Middle Eastern, or African Jew, the monogenist argument about the importance of climate determinism was confirmed, and the doctrine of the unitary origin of humankind was preserved. So you had monogenists. Monogenists believe that we all have a common origin. Polygenists would say, no, you have a separate origin. And this is where this anti-Semite, this racism comes in. And even in his book, he reveals when they were pushing Darwin's doctrine of men evolving from apes, they would say, "Oh, you have your own special ape that your people evolved from." They would say that about the Jews and the blacks alike because they believed in polygenism. They didn't believe that we all share the same common origin, which genetics has debunked that we all share the same common male and female ancestors. So it says, this, as we have repeatedly seen, put an obstacle in the path of the polygenist theory. Some, like the knowledgeable and scholarly polygenist English surgeon Charles White, or the French anthropologist Jean-Louis Armand, got around the racial immutability theory, often supported by the fact that the white Jews of Cochin had managed to stay the same color for millennia, by arguing that Jews were not actually white anywhere, as White wrote. These people, they said, are scattered over the face of the earth, have preserved themselves distinct from the rest of the world by their religion, and as they never marry any but their own sect, so they have no mixture of blood in their veins, that they should differ from each other. Yet nothing is more true than the English Jew is white, the Portuguese Swarthy, the American olive, the Arabian copper, and the African black. In short, that there appears to be as many species of Jews as there are countries in which they reside. Now, granting them the fact as to color, the premises are by no means just, for the Jews have gained proselytes in every part of the world where they have resided, and they are at liberty to marry those proselytes. But the truth is that Jews are generally swarthy in every clime or every climate. As we're going to see, they're going to say they're usually brown, right? It says white was not alone. There was persistent line of reasoning which grew in strength during the 19th century, particularly in polygenist anthropology, that in order to get out the snare set by the existence of a color spectrum among Jews, argued that all Jews were the same color, brown. In addition, following a much older template, which we already discussed, there was parallel line of thought that argued Jews everywhere were black, were derived from black Africans, had black blood, and displayed a Negro look. This perspective was to burgeon in importance in the second half of the 19th century and on into the 20th, when during the period of the Third Reich, it flowered into a conflation of black and Jew, in which not only were Jews accorded many of the supposed physical attributes of blacks, but were also perceived as manipulating them in the Jews' remorseless war against Aryan racial purity. The perceived typologies of Jews and Negroes within this discourse range from close to identical, and they constantly fed into each other. The increasing racialization of blacks, particularly during the periods of the American Civil War, again, as we brought out Saturday, you start seeing this racialization of blacks in the Civil War as a mechanism of white supremacy to use to suppress blacks that outnumbered many of the Southern white, the defeated Confederates, right, and had more trades and skills than the defeated Confederates. So to stop them being overthrown and overran by Southern blacks, they over-racialized, and they came up with white supremacy to keep us at bay. You understand? That's what it was made for. It's like in Nazi Germany, they wanted to keep the Jews at bay, remove and everything. The same playbook. It's the ideologies and ideologues, right? It says, in the European scramble for Africa was mirrored by increasing racialization of Jews. Let me read that again. The increasing racialization of blacks, particularly during the periods of the American Civil War, and the European scramble for Africa was mirrored by the increasing racialization of Jews. This is why this book is called Hybrid Hate. All right? In black terms, as Gilman put it, open quote, in the eyes of the non-Jew who defined them in Western society, the Jews became the blacks, close quote. This metaphorical but not necessarily semantic leap involved, as Brooms accurately put it, taking the Jew at once as an ambivalent inner and outer black and white other. In other words, the Jew as an archetypal European internal other became by the process archetypal external other, which since medieval times had always been a dark figure from the global south, a Moor, a Negro, a blackamoor. The ambivalence in this construct, as we see, arose in part from the fact that doubts persisted about the actual Semitic color of Jews. However, the construction of Jews as black clearly involved a lot more than color. Neil McMaster explained the construction of Africanization of Jews from the simple logic of associating Jews with the racial category that immediately and instinctively aroused the most negative and powerful feeling of revulsion in European society. In searching for an interactive metaphor which most readily convey the external fixity of Jewish racial otherness, anti-Semites turned to the black. What he meant by this is that in trying to convey the unchanging otherness of Jews, European society selected an equally immutable figure to typify Jews, the African black. The process was interactive because it would also influence markedly the way in which people of color throughout the world were constructed. This interactive process involved Jews being constructed as blacks at the same time, and for similar reasons, blacks being constructed as Jews. The conflation of Jew and Negro was constructed on the earlier foundations of centuries of writing and thought, detailing inseparable links between Jews and Negroes and their unique position in the world as people's part from generality of humankind. It was constructed on the occasional medieval conviction that Jews were black and the more recent obsession with the notion of Jews of color throughout the world. This conflation was thus a culmination of ancient historical and racial theory and produced the fusion of two ancient streams of hate, the hatred of Jews and the hatred of blacks. The fusion of these hatreds did much to radicalize feelings about Jews and blacks over the following years. That's why I took out the time to read this to you guys. You understand, when you guys promote anti-Semitism, you become black Hebrew Nazis, you become pro-black Nazis, you're also supporting a movement that is married to the racial theory, which is married to not only the hatred of Jews, but also the hatred of blacks. This is why it's so ironic and so paradoxical for African Americans to adopt and speak and believe or invoke anti-Semitism. It's very ironic because they share the same purpose. Watch this. It says, this conflation was thus the culmination of an ancient historical and racial theory and produced the fusion of two ancient streams of hate, the hatred of Jews and the hatred of blacks. The fusion of these hatreds did much to radicalize feelings about Jews and blacks over the following years. The anti-Semite Robert Knox was one of the first 19th century physical anthropologists to argue unambiguously that Jews were of Negro origin. His thinking, as set out in The Races of Men, has to be viewed against the backdrop of the fight for political emancipation of British Jews, which Knox opposed, but which, when he was writing his book, was well on the way to being won. So a lot of these anti-Semites, they were against the emancipation of Jews. A lot of people don't understand Jews were emancipated to the late 19th century in many of these European countries. So they were dealing with a lot of this, oppression, repression, and suppression, right? Until the 18th century in these different countries. It says Knox's disappointment with this turn of events drips off the page. You got to understand something. For all you Deuteronomy 28:68 people that love to swear by that, you had Jews during this time, especially in Britain, being shipped over in ships, right, to do forced labor, right? They was basically slaves. I brought this out a long time ago, and it went over y'all head. There's a book called The History of England, I think it is. I have it on my hard drive that talks about that, what they call penal slaves, where people get convicted of certain stuff. They get sold into slavery, galley slaves and stuff of that nature. The Jews were one of those people groups too. I actually fall victim to that. Right here, let's keep reading. So, anticipating the arguments of the German anti-Semite Wilhelm Marr, a few years later, he argued that Jews had no right to emancipation. They were categorically not part of the Caucasian race. Indeed, they belonged. Again, this Wilhelm Marr, this German anti-Semite, is the one who termed anti-Semite. Right? He created the term. They were proud to call themselves that. They announced that they were that. Right? And he was a Democrat. Right? But again, 70% of Jews vote Democrat and 90% of blacks vote Democrat. You explain that too. But anyway, this is him. So they were categorically not part of the Caucasian race. Indeed, they belonged to the dark races of men. They were African and Asiatic, not European. The purest of the Jewish race is dark, tawny, yellow-colored person with jet black hair and eyes seemingly colored. There is no mistaking the race when pure. It is Egyptian, that is African. A series of incorrect observations commencing with Blumenbach but not terminating with Pritchard led to errors which no doubt will hold their grounds for centuries. Knox's conviction that Jews had black blood was shared by Gobineau, whose essay in 1853, according to Gobineau, a distant alliance millennia ago between the Semites and Hamites had led to the infusion of black blood into the Jewish people. This black blood has remained and was largely responsible for the Jews' lack of true culture. Again, this is racial essentialism, which many of you guys have espoused, right? They say, okay, Jews have black blood, therefore they don't have a true culture. Same thing was going on and being taught in the Americas. Like blacks have no culture, they have no history, they have no ancestry. Again, this is why the book is called Hybrid Hate. This is anti-Semitism. It said Jews were no more than hybrid mulattoes with a Negro core. This ancient black core was the remnant of a very primitive people who lived in caves and was feared by travelers. The idea that Jewish cultural specificity was closely linked with African primitivism would linger until after the Second World War, as we will show. So you start seeing a lot of these ideas come out the mainstream after the Second World War because the world sees what happens with Nazis, and then they begin to repudiate it, right? Different countries had distinct purposes to which the exciting new science of physical anthropology could be put. In Germany, after 1870, it was used to demonstrate the links between various populations of New German Reich. In France, after the humiliation of the Franco-German War, physical anthropology was employed to restore national dignity through attempts to identify the ancestors of modern French as a warrior people. In Great Britain, ethnologists in general, including Pritchard and monogenist Robert Gordon Latham, had a particular interest in analyzing the variety of peoples who made up Britain's fast expanding overseas empire and how they relate to each other. This involved comparisons of a whole range of black and brown peoples throughout the world with their British masters. Latham was the author of Natural History of Varieties of Man and the ethnology of the British colonies' independence. Like Knox, Gobineau, and a number of his contemporaries, Latham, helped build the growing consensus that Negroes were significantly different from Europeans and that Jews, while necessarily shared an identical color with Negroes, were nonetheless very similar to them. Points of similarity, he wrote, with the Semitic nations is the rule rather than the exception with the African tribes, Negro and non-Negro, a fact which makes Jews, Arabs, and Syrians African rather than Africans Semitic. And that's Latham, 1850. The idea that Jews and Negroes had common origins was expressed more and more frequently from mid-century. As was made clear in this discourse, signs of Negroid characteristics and descent were more obvious in some Jews than others. In fact, there were sometimes assumed to be two distinct types of Jews, one mainly Semitic and the other mainly Negroid. And less room the races of humans by Abel, the lawyer, radical political figure, and from 1890 president of the Ecole, argued following a medieval template that while Africans resemble apes, the chief characteristic of the Jew was the accentuated profile of the goat. But side by side with the finer type of goat-like Jew was a coarser Negroid and simian Jewish type, with wavy or frizzly hair, rather flat lips, and much wider nose. Abel saw in this proof of ancient cross with a less advanced race, by which he meant that at some time in the more or less remote past, Jews have mingled and crossed with black Africans. The Cambridge anthropologist Alfred Court Haddon made a similar contribution to the question of Jewish origins. In the Study of Man, 1898, he argued that there were in fact two quite different fundamental types of Jews. One section of the Jewish people, the superior type, had an intelligent and dignified appearance. So real quick, I guess y'all can guess which one was the intelligent and dignified appearance in their mind. The one that looked more white iron type, right? It said the other type, seemingly Negroid, descending from the lower elements, like blacks everywhere. These low types had round head, the forehead low and retreating, but the nose is rarely much developed. In many cases, the lips are thick and the hair is frizzly. Subsequently, in 1903, the ferociously, almost paradoxically anti-Semitic French pamphleteer, the pseudonymous Dr. Celticus, also perceived two distinct strands of Jews. He was initially led to this conclusion by the existence of two kinds of noses among the Jews: the typical hook nose, representing the true Jew, and a horrible, degenerate, round snub nose, which was considered to be typically African. This African form of nose came about as a result of the crossing of Jews and Negroes, conflating two of the seminal symbols of Jews and blacks, goats and apes. He argued that as a result of the mixing of blood, while the Jews more often than not looked and smelled like goats, some of the younger ones, like Negroes, also looked like apes. And in general, the jutting jaw of the Jew, like that of the Negro, was reminiscent of both goats and gorillas. The gorilla trope introduced by Celticus was not uncommon in the construction of Jews, and indeed was a way of associating them with Negroes. Hold on, y'all. I went back. Okay, here we go. It says ears were often viewed as potent characters of somatic difference. Sir Arthur Keefe, the conservator of the Hunterian Museum of Royal Colleges of Surgeons in London, was convinced that it was the human's ears' external configuration that was the most viable racial label. Jews' ears in particular were often pounced on as being a giveaway somatic indicators and were frequently compared, like those of Negroes, to ears of gorillas and monkeys. So many of the same verbiage they were using to, describe Negroes, they would use for Jews, as we just read. They're basically saying Jews and blacks had ears like monkeys. Now, this was the racist discourse that was going on during this time, and it shows you the inherent flaw of trying to judge someone solely on their morphology. This shit is just silly. But again, you got BHIs, you got pro-blacks that have adopted this method, and they use this method to this day. So let's keep reading. It says, of many shared characteristics of Jews and Negroes, foul smell was one of the most frequently invoked. And as we have noted in the earlier age, in the olfactory slur against Jews and Negroes was persistent over centuries. John Crawford, the Scottish polygynist, nicknamed because of his outspoken polygynism, the inventor of 40 Atoms, noted that Africans had a peculiar odor of the skin, offensive to and unknown in the other races of man. And this was a universal motif in the anti-black rhetoric of the American slave states. Wilhelm Marr, the self-styled patriarch of anti-Semitism, visited the United States and was initially well disposed to the blacks, but nonetheless was appalled by the smell of the group of blacks he encountered in a railway carriage. He complained that they stank of tin muskrats. The Negro aroma, wrote Richard Burton, can be distinguished, I believe, amongst all the pure tribes. Exertion of body brings it out, and mental emotion, as among ferrets. During coition, it is painfully developed. So this is William Marr, the guy who coined anti-Semite, the guy who hated Jews. And when he went to the United States, he was exposed to these blacks, and he basically was using the same arguments and same hateful anti-black rhetoric, and just the same rhetoric he was using against Jews was applied here to blacks, right? It says here, Burton found little to like in the Jewish body either. From the eyes, the small fat-lidded organ of the Jew, to the Jew smell, which went by the name Bui Shemit in Persia. Some years later, Dr. Celticus developed this medieval Jew odor trope as he sought to define precisely what the smell of Jews actually was. This, he admitted, was a difficult task, but according to the pseudonymous doctor, even the most costly French soaps of the time, such as the Congo or the Crimson Clover scent, introduced in 1898 by Paris firm L.T. Piver, would do nothing whatsoever to help the wealthy Jewish get rid of her smell, no matter how hard she tried. George Alice Montandon was a French-Swiss anthropologist and author of the Comment of the Jews, How to Recognize and Explain the Jew, whose anthropological writing on the Jews viewed that the Dr. Celticus for sheer viciousness. Montandon combined the trope of Jewish and Negro odor by arguing that the bad smell of Jews was something inherited directly from their Negro ancestors. In fact, the smell of the Jew was the smell of the Negro. So again, we're seeing more evidence that this anti-Semitism stuff, right, is something that is, lockstep with anti-black rhetoric, anti-black racism. It's one and the same, because they were merging the two. They said, oh, wait a minute, the Jews smell like this because their ancient ancestors were Negroes, and they don't smell too good either, right? See, y'all thought y'all not gonna get this nowhere else, man. You know what I'm saying? Of course, he wrote the book, but I'm bringing this out. I'm bringing this to you guys so you guys can have an understanding. As the scriptures say, and all by getting, get it for understanding. So I want you guys to really understand anti-Semitism, right? So it says here, French historian Leon Poliakov argued that whereas Jews and blacks represented fundamental racial categories, there was nonetheless such great differences in specificity of the hatred of Jews and the hatred of blacks that they could hardly be viewed in the same light. Poliakov pointed out that in the case of Johann Wolfgang, the great writer's fundamental objection to Jews arose from their arrogant claim to be the chosen people and from their financial astuteness. This, argued Poliakov, was akin to the hatred of the oppressive master of father figure, whereas hatred of blacks was based on their lustfulness and their animalistic qualities. Expressed in Freudian terms, the Jews embodied A and the blacks A. So I can't read these phrases, so bear with me, y'all. It says the different expressions of the id and the superego thus explain why, according to the Poliakov, criticisms made respectively of Jews and blacks in general have little or nothing to do with each. However, the hybridic conflation of Jews and blacks, the alleged animalistic features they had in common, their disturbing color, smell, racial immutability, exceptionalism, the sexual fear and desire they both provoked, and the close to identical construction of Jews and blacks during the Third Reich and the fascist Italy and earlier weighed very heavily against his analysis. So this guy is claiming that they're not similar in the hatred they get. But he said, hey, I wrote a whole damn book showing that it's very similar to the arguments about smell. They're saying they smell bad because their ancestors were Negroes. Right? And I've shared before in prior videos that you had an anti-Semite pretty much say the Jews should be working in the Caribbean side by side their black African brothers enslaved. That's what you should do to them. It says powerful links between anti-black racism and the racial hatred of Jews may be seen in various European contexts. It has been argued, for instance, not least by the German Jewish political philosopher Hannah, that the seeds of the persecution and final destruction of Jews in Germany and other parts of Europe were propagated by colonial persecution of blacks, and particularly by the racism and genocide perpetrated by the Germans in their colonies, especially in German Southwest Africa, today's Namibia, and the genocides of the Herero and Namaqua peoples that occurred between 1904 and 1907. The idea of genocide, the model of genocide, had been produced as a template that could later be copied. However, there is a complicating aspect to this analysis. Of all black Africans, it was the Khoikhoi or Khoi, the indigenous pastoralists of southwestern Africa, termed Hottentots by the Dutch and subsequently by other Europeans who became a paradigm of radically extreme other and the ugly race par excellence. A monstrous race that perhaps formed a missing link between true humanity and the orangutan. So real quick, going to make a note here. A lot of Darwin, a lot of social Darwin is going on during this time, and you keep seeing these references to gorillas and orangutans. These Khoikhoi people are the missing link. That this was common discourse to races. And this is why people today reject the Darwinist model, because a lot of these talking points were echoed using Darwin in a racist light. All right, so it says here in 1497, right at the beginning of Western exploration of Southern Africa, the Portuguese explorer Vasco da Gama referred to them as small in stature, ugly of face. And this trope would continue in a journal entry in 1657. Jan van Riebeck, the Dutch colonial administrator who founded Cape Town, said that they were very ugly and stinking people. While in 1684, Francois Bernier, the French physician and traveler discussed earlier, noted that they seemed to constitute a different type from those of the rest of Africa, usually smaller, thinner, and uglier faces, passionately fond of carrion meat, which they eat raw, and they wind bits of the guts around their arms and necks. The French philosopher and mathematician Pierre Louis concluded that while all black Africans constitute a new type of mankind, he had observed that on the southernmost tip of African continents were to be found the most hideous people in the world, the Hottentots. Real quick, before I continue reading, I also want to bring some commentary here as well for what we just read, because notice what was in the discourse, what was in the ideology. He said, concluded that while all black Africans constitute a new type of mankind, that's because many people were polygynous. They came up with this theory. The reason why they came to polygynous is because the Christian doctrine says that everyone shares the same ancestor, but they were pushing these ideas of race, and the ideas of race and the Christian doctrine and the biblical doctrine, they clash, because the idea of race is the idea of different groups of individuals having different forefathers that had nothing to do with each other, right? They come from their own species, in other words. So this is why you see this type of verbiage. It says, concluded that while all black Africans constituted a new type of mankind. And you hear some of these talking points being reverberated through BHI, through pro-black, especially BHIs, when they say, oh, white people come from fallen angels, or people come from the beasts of the field. These are doctrines that were already taught European circles that are being recirculated now in a so-called Black Hebrew Israelite community. It says here the prurient interest shown in the ugliness of Hottentots is exemplified by the regular exploitation of the Khoikhoi in fairs, private homes, and circuses. One Khoikhoi woman, the famous so-called Hottentot Venus, Sarah Bartman, was exhibited as a freak in Great Britain and France. You guys all should know who Sarah Bartman is. Another Khoikhoi girl was shown in the United States by P.T. Barnum as representing the missing link between apes and humankind. There goes that Darwin theory again that is being invoked with these racial categories. Oh, this must be a link. The French naturalist Georges Cuvier, who, as we have seen, believed that Black Africans were the least developed human group on the earth on account of their compressed skull, danced with Bartman at a voyeuristic Paris gathering. He was so intrigued that on her death, he made a plaster cast of her body and preserved her skeleton, genitals, and brain, which was subsequently displayed in the museum in Paris. The museum's director, Geoffrey St. Hilaire, a specialist in teratology, the study of monsters and abnormalities, was even more obsessed by Bartman and Cuvier. The taxonomic racial tradition represented so tragically by Bartman intersected the taxonomic tradition that concerned Jews. Jews, blacks, or dark and hideous to behold were regularly inserted into the category of the Hottentots. From the 17th century on, Hottentots were regarded by many scholars and travelers as having Jewish biological roots, to be literally descendants of Jews. One of these scholars was Pete Coleman, an astronomer from Bavaria, who was sent by the Dutch to the Cape to explore southern Africa and make astronomical and meteorological observations. His book, Nuremberg, 1719, came out in Dutch in 1727, in French in 1743, English in 1731, as a present state of the Cape of the Good Hope, or a particular account of several nations of the Hottentots, their religion, government, laws, customs, ceremonies, and opinions. It had considerable success, and for the next 50 years at least, was a definitive account of the Hottentots. He claimed not only that the customs and traditions of the Hottentots were similar to those of the Jews, but that biologically they should be counted among the children of Abraham and that they were of Jewish blood. Other scholars followed the same line of reasoning in the radical conflation of Jews and blacks. The African people, widely considered to be the ugliest in the world, were in fact descended from Europe's ugliest people, the Jews. On the African colonial frontier, there was a long-standing conflation of Jews and Hottentots. Indeed, the biological origins of countless African tribes were explicated in Jewish terms, just as their religion and languages were found derived respectively from the biblical Judaism and Hebrew. Viewed from this perspective, it may not be fanciful to draw a connection between the genocide of the Hottentots by Germans and the later genocide of their supposed kinsmen. Aaron did not mention that Hottentots had been constructed as Jews and as Africans, ugly people, par excellence for hundreds of years in the work of European travelers and scholars. Nonetheless, this conflation of Jews and the ugliest of all Black Africans was widely known and had long been inserted into the mental cartography of the West, and the genocide of so-called Hottentots and allied peoples was also, in a sense, a genocide of Jews. A number of political theorists have failed to find the continuities suggested by Aaron have argued that the most potent seeds of Holocaust are to be found in aspects of 19th century German anti-Semitism or in excesses perpetrated by German troops during the First World War, or in Poland or France during the early stages of the Second World War. But it could perhaps be argued that German racially inspired anti-Black hatred shown in German Southwest Africa, elsewhere in German colonies, and consistently during the period of the Third Reich. The growing hatred of Jews, understood increasingly in racial terms, the eventual conflation of these two seminal hatreds of the West were among our powerful factors responsible for the virulent form of Jew hatred in that developed in Germany after the First World War and accumulated in the Holocaust. So basically what we just read is a lot of these ideas they had about Hottentots, which is Khoikhoi people, pretty much sparked the same or similar hatred they had for Jews, which led up to the Holocaust. European racism was undoubtedly affected by currents in other parts of the world. American anti-black prejudice and legislation, for instance, influenced German colonial and metropolitan treatment of blacks. The American legislature and social model of anti-black discrimination also had considerable bearing on the development of racial attitude toward Jews and will continue to do so. As we shall see throughout the period of the Third Reich, a telling example of American influence may be perceived in the works of the important political agitator Wilhelm Marr, the self-styled patriarch of anti-Semitism. So again, anybody asks you, what does anti-Semitism mean? Always go back to Wilhelm Marr because he's the one who coined the term. And again, the term is pretty much stating that these German Jews are Semites and we're against them, anti-Semite. That's where it comes from. It says, who is often termed the founder of the modern anti-Semitism, born in Marburg, the son of a flamboyant theatrical personality who was often assumed to be a Jew. Marr had 3 Jewish wives, was fond of their families, loved one of them to distraction, and recanted his odious views rather pathetically on his deathbed, which was attended by poverty and obscurity. Marr started his political career in Switzerland as an out-and-out radical with anarchist leanings. After the failure of the 1848 revolution and the reinstatement of the ancient regime, Marr decided to head off to Costa Rica to seek his fortune. Observing with growing approval the slavery of black Africans in Central America and also the United States, he developed a fiercely racist views. So he was observing and he approved slavery that he had witnessed in Central America and the United States. And that pretty much bolstered his racist views, man. This is why, again, the book's called Hybrid Hate. When you talk about anti-Semitism, you also have to talk about the element of anti-black and racism. It says in Nicaragua, he referred to indigenous people as 1/3 tiger, 1/3 monkey, and at least 1/3 pig. And they declared it would really be a pity if it were true that all human beings are brothers. So he didn't even want to entertain the idea that all human beings are brothers. And I'm telling you right now that you have BHIs, you have pro-black people that have this same mode, this same ideology. They share this same ideology by trying to say certain groups are aliens, monsters, or Nephilim, and they're just crazy stuff, man. And they don't want to concede the idea that they are brothers with Europeans or vice versa. You have the same thing going on in Clubhouse with secular Jews, for the most part, that we have spoke to. They share this same sentiment here. They don't want to fathom that all human beings are brothers. That concept they don't like. They don't like that concept. And this is a concept of racism. It says here, he was accused of having stated that Negroes were closer to animals than human beings, and was even charged with slave trading by the Berlin Central Colonization Society. For all the people, tomorrow midterms, man, all you people voting Democrat, this is a Democrat. This is the legacy of the Democrats. Back in Germany, he wrote provocatively in defense of the American enslavement of blacks and having turned his back on the progressive causes he had once supported. And through a process that involved a conflation of Jews and blacks, he became what he called an anti-Semite. He is often credited with the invention of this term, although it now seems he simply played a role in the process of the coinage. In a polemical pamphlet, hold on, y'all. We went back. Hold on, y'all. Let me get back to my page where it says polemical pamphlet. What's going in, man? I accidentally hit my mouse. That's that page. I can't wait till we get to that page right there. All right, polemical pamphlet called A Mirror to the Jews. Following Knox, Gobineau, and many other contemporary naturalists, he argued that the despised blood of the Negro flowed freely in the veins of the Jews. He went on to write a best-selling tract, The Victory of Jewry over Germandom. It had great success, and the last of the 12 editions was exploited to drum up support for its new political party, the Anti-Semites League. So see, these Germans will call themselves anti-Semites. They call themselves that, right? This is the origin of it, right? Which, despite its failure, can be seen as launching modern political racial anti-Semitism. Marr became a racist in America. In respect, he may be compared with the Irishman John Campbell, the one-time progressive Chartist who transformed himself in the United States to a fervent anti-black racist with strong views about radical differences of the Jew, or William Cobbett, the revered English radical political activist who went to the United States and became a reactionary pro-slavery bigot, as well as an anti-Semite. He may be compared with Alfred Plotz, the coiner of the term race hygiene, who learned to admire American racism during his sojourn in the United States and gradually became a leading racial theorist with respect to the Jews. So these people were learning how to hate Jews through anti-black racism that they were witnessing in the Americas. All right. Let's see. It says, indeed, as we shall see, German anti-Semites will continue to be nourished and inspired by the model of American anti-black racism for many decades to come. Keep reading. Matter of fact, let me read that again. Let me rewind this so I can define that. It says, indeed, as we shall see, German anti-Semites will continue to be nourished and inspired by the model of American anti-black racism for many days to come. The message was clear. What America was doing to its Negroes, Europe could do it to its own Negroes, the Jews. As far as these figures are concerned, and figures much closer to our own time as well, there's a straight line connecting anti-black racism with anti-Semitism. This is why this is absurd for anybody to support anti-Semitism or trying to make light of it. It's directly connected to black racism. It's directly connected to the negative experience that our ancestors had here in the Americas. So let me read it again. There is a straight line connecting anti-black racism with anti-Semitism. As Mark shows, at precisely the moment when European Jews were officially being perceived as citizens and no longer as outsiders or pariahs, new ways of expressing hatred of Jews were being devised. It was no longer adequate to argue that Judaism as a religion or other social features of the Jews were at the roots of Jews' difference and inferiority. As the Enlightenment had argued, something more fundamental was now required. Marr argued that all differences between Jews and others had to do with race and blood. So again, anti-Semite had everything to do with race and blood, and then he said, look, you're not using your religion as an escape hatch. In the past, we will allow you to convert into Christianity, and then everything will be hunky-dory. No, today, no, you can't do that. You are immutable. Your status as being as a Semite is immutable. Nothing you can do about that. So therefore, we have to, move you out of business. Invoke the legislature to write laws against you, oppress you and repress you. Same thing. Again, where they get to, they were inspired by Democrats in the Americas and how they treated blacks. That's where they get that inspiration from. It says, Marr argued that all differences between Jews and others had to do with race and blood. Nothing else mattered. Marr wrote of an innate, ugly, inferior Jewish physical qualities, just as previously he had written of Negroes' ugliness, bestiality, physical inadequacy, and incompetence. But for Marr, the Jew had become more than just the racially different, inferior, and unchanging equivalent of the Negro. The conflation of the Jew and the Negro had created a hybrid, part Jew, part black. Jews and Negroes, as we have seen in the case of the so-called Hottentots, were often hybridized through their ugliness. Ugliness obviously acts as a powerful tool of identity demarcation and as an agent of devalorization, provoking contempt and hatred. Ugliness was the chief taxonomic tool of Christa Meiners, the polygynous German historian, philosopher, and Göttingen professor, who is considered one of the founders of scientific racism. Miners had a great influence on Gobineau and the embittered Scot Robert Knox. His views would later be greatly admired by the Nazis. His views will later be greatly admired by the Nazis. Miners outlining the history of mankind, Franklin Leipzig, argued that every race in the world had a separate founding event. He argued that every race in the world had a separate founding event. So my question to the audience and my question to, maybe some of the Black Hebrew Israelites that may be tuned in, do you hold the same value? Do you hold the same ideology that these different races are from a separate founding event and have nothing to do with yours? We got to start talking about that. We're going to have to start doing some soul searching here on the channel, man, because a lot of the talking points you guys have reflect these racist people of the past. Let's keep going. He argued, moreover, that a principal characteristic of the race was the extent to which it was ugly or beautiful, and he posited an overarching division of the humankind into the beautiful white race and an animalistic and monstrous ugly black race. A colleague called Miners the beloved philosopher of our fatherland, but he showed little love to much of humanity. Blacks he demonized as cannibals and as monsters. They had a frightful tiger-like, hardly human look, their teeth locked together like a bite of the fox. They so love human flesh that they bite huge chunks of flesh from the arms or legs of their neighbors and fellow slaves and swallow them down. Jews were included in the ugly category. They were often understood to be both ugly and permanently degenerate. Jews and Negroes linked in this widely articulated vision through their physical and spiritual ugliness were two groups incapable, as we have seen, of being absorbed into Western society. The physical and moral ugliness, monstrosity, and blackness that has so often been attributed to Jews in medieval Europe inserted them automatically into the same category as Negroes. The other archetypically primitive, ugly, monstrous race. Marked by these internal and external markers, Miner insisted neither blacks nor Jews could demand the same rights as whites and Christians. Miners insisted neither blacks nor Jews could demand the same rights as whites and Christians. We fast forward to today. This is the danger of teaching racial essentialism and tying everything to a racial category and your skin color. This is the danger of it. Because then it's going to argue that who has rights and who can have rights based off these colors and this idea of racial superiority and inferiority, as we see here, as we've seen in Nazi Germany, and as we've seen in early America. Let's keep reading. Self-evidently, monstrous Jews could not become Christians any more than monstrous Negroes could become white. In the American slave states, the absolute ugliness of Negroes was regularly emphasized. There's less beauty in the general form and outline of the Negro, opined Matthew Estes of Columbus, Mississippi in 1846, than in that of the white man. He has a flat, ugly foot, evidently designed like the foot of a camel to tread upon the sands of the great tropical deserts. The Negro has a large mouth, ugly features. Of the 19 principal defects found among Jews and elaborated in a racialized vision of the hate-filled Dr. Celticus, ugliness was paramount. McMaster has argued that the association between black and Jew can be interpreted as one particular example of the wider process of racialization. However, while the Jew was invariably racialized as a Negro, the relationship rarely flowed in the opposite direction, such as the black people were denigrated as Jews. This unidirectional linkage derives from the fact that blacks constituted from an early stage the basic model of the inferior racial other, which was deployed to blacken and racialize Jews. And the reality of linkage was not unidirectional. 19th century race theorists linked Jews with Negroes and also linked Negroes with Jews. The odium attached to the Jews long before the Enlightenment was at least as great as the attached to blacks. The articulation of similarity in the skin tone and other features of blacks and Jews may be seen on the one hand as part of a project to denigrate Jews, but it must also be seen as part of a larger narrative of the inferiorization of black colored, and other colonized people throughout the world. Since the European voyages of discovery began in the 15th century, Europeans had systematically constructed little-known peoples from the Aztecs to the Aztecs to the New Zealand Maori as Jews or Israelites. This is such widespread phenomenon that is strange that has not been investigated more thoroughly by post-colonial theorists. The Judaizing hybridization of the colonial world had the perhaps unintended effect of inserting such colonized or soon to be colonized people into a category of known and understood otherness, as well as a category of inferiority and subjugation. While the exploration and colonization of Africa, Black people with their various cultures came into view as they never had before and had to be explained and understood. African Blacks from the ugly people, the Maasai, the Yoruba, Igbo, Tutsi, Zulu, Xhosa, Basa, Ibio, Fula, Bayankole, Baluba, Khoikhoi, Shona, Makalanga, Isan, Ifik, Baluba, Fan, Fulani, Meru, Inga, and Soniki. The Tivia, among others, were regularly constructed, racialized, explained, perceived, and described precisely as Jews, as people with biological Jewish roots whose lives, ideas, and practices, remnants of an ancient Judaism, could still allegedly be made out, and whose languages traced to Hebrew could still allegedly be identified, and whose veins of Jewish blood assuredly flowed. Unfortunately, space will not permit me to further describe this element of the conflation of Jews and Blacks in the Western imaginary. In any event, these conflations have been exhaustively considered elsewhere. I first explored the construction of Africans as Jews in my Lost Tribes of Israel, and subsequently in a book I wrote with Yulia, Genetics, Mass Media, Identity. And in my Black Jews in Africa and the Americas, y'all should be familiar with that. I read that entire book on the channel. It says here, a number of scholars have contributed to this field, notably Edith Bruder, who completed her doctorate at the School of Oriental and African Studies, University of London, under my supervision, and went to publish her work. And more recently, Nathan DeVere, William Miles, John Jackson, and a number of others. The projections that had been described in this growing body of scholarship were often internalized by Africans themselves, in many cases developed into imagined ethnicities and new religious movements. Similarly, Blacks toiling in the slave farms of the Americas perceived themselves as Israelites toiling in Egypt's bondage. And this metaphorical association fed into the development of new Black Jewish ethnicities in the United States and new religious movements more or less associated with the religions of Jews. Such conflation of Jewish and Negro experience had the effect of demeaning Jews by association with primitive Black people and demeaning Blacks by association with Jews. While colonized Blacks and African slaves in the United States were being constructed or were constructing themselves as Jews, Jews were being inserted into a category of colonized Blacks. During the Enlightenment, particularly in Germany, but elsewhere as well, Jews were repeatedly imagined into a classification of enslaved and subjugated peoples, particularly Blacks. Johann David Michaelis, the distinguished Hebraist, was a member of the Göttingen School of History, which played a decisive role in the development of racial thought, principally through the work of Blumenbach and Meiners. And I can't invoke this enough. Blumenbach plays a pivotal role in your ideas of how race works and racial essentialism. Everything's going to go, all roads go back to Blumenbach when we're talking about racial categories. It says here in 1782, Michaelis proposed that Jews who could not a priori be assimilated into the Prussian state should, like Black African slaves, be settled in overseas slave plantations. So as we see here, this is another commonality with the anti-Semitism. They would say stuff like this. Like, you should be over there with your brothers anyway. You should be enslaved, just like that. It says, in discussions about the extent to which Jews could or could not be incorporated into European political structures, the expulsion and resettlement of Jews became a popular option. Between 1774 and 1819, there was no less than 40 proposals for settling European Jews in colonies in remote parts of the world, such as the Caribbean or Australia, where the first British penal system settlements for convicts were established. So I was talking about earlier, they were shipping out Jews to America, and obviously they see here Australia as penal settlements. It says Michaelis argued that in Prussia there was no use for Jews. They could not really be made productive or beneficial, but they could be transformed into rather more useful Negroes. If only Prussia owned sugar islands, he lamented, Jews could be put to work in the Caribbean, where their non-European origins as a southern race of Asiatic refugees would enable them to engage in hard labor alongside their black brothers in the unhealthy climate of the slave colonies. Often constructed in a discourse as black Negro and servile, Jews once again began to resemble representations of their medieval forebears. At the same time as Jews in Europe and the United States were being understood as having black blood, the model of American treatment of blacks was inspiring attitudes towards Europe's Jews. Black ethnic groups throughout Africa, indeed people of color throughout the world, were being understood and explicated in every remote corner of the colonized world as having Jewish blood. Suffice it is to say here that an endemic feature of the colonial project was the universal construction of imagined Jewish and Israelite histories for a vast number of world's peoples. This phenomenon is one of the most revealing linkages between Jews and blacks. One of the most influential of all 19th century race theorists, Houston Stewart Chamberlain, the influential Germophile, British racialist writer, set himself the task of explaining both the written work and music of his father-in-law to be Richard Wagner and a systematic racial narrative. In 1899, he published The Foundation of the 19th Century, which expounded his belief in greatness, beauty, and creativity of the Aryan peoples. Much influenced Gobineau and Chamberlain to believe that the blood of blacks flowed in the veins of Jews. This was not much emphasized by Chamberlain, and he did not waste time over it. As he put it, all historically great races and nations have been produced by mixing. But wherever the difference of type is too great to be bridged over, then we have mongrels. As a matter of fact, the current opinion is that Semite and even the purest Bedouin type are the most absolute mongrels imaginable, the product of a cross between Negro and white man. Racial mixing, according to him, was a normal phenomenon, but in the case of the Jews, it involved a cross between two incompatible races, thus created something monstrous. Chamberlain proclaimed that Gobineau preached this doctrine 50 years ago and was laughed at. Today, his opinion is the orthodox one. Ranke, he meant Frederick Ratzel, defines it thus in The Folk. The Semites belong to the mulatto class, a transition between black and white. The Frederick Ratzel to whom Chamberlain intended to refer was a geographer and ethnographer best known for inventing the word Lebensraum in the Nazi sense of racial nationalist expansion. Ratzel agreed that the Jews had indeed mingled with surrounding nations, which would explain the physical differences between, for instance, German Jews and Portuguese co-religionists. But no matter with whom they mixed, the effect of Negro blood was always present, even among the Jews of Northern Europe. Something of a mulatto strain remained even among the blonde Jews. The conflation of Jews and Negroes' racial characteristics, very much along the lines they were imagined by mid-century racial theorists, was exploited by revolutionary socialist, philosopher, and economist Karl Marx. In an attack in 1863 on the Jewish socialist leader Ferdinand Lassalle, Marx invoked the ancient anti-Semitic trope claiming that Jews descend from a rabble of Negroes, lepers, and Hebrews who had joined together in the exodus from Egypt. British historian Paul Johnson called this allegation the fundamental matrix of anti-Semitism. The label and brought it and repeated throughout the centuries with extraordinary persistence. Johnson Paul, Marx prefigured the latter conflations of anti-black racism and anti-Semitism by calling LaSalle a Jewish nigger. He explained that as both the shape of his head and his hair texture shows, he descends from the Negroes who joined Moses' flight from Egypt, unless his mother or grandmother on the paternal side hybridized with a nigger. Now, this combination of Germanness and Jewishness with a primarily Negro substance creates a strange product. The pushiness of the fellow is also nigger-like. So everybody that wants to be Marxist, that's your father, the communist. It says here, and also I want to make note here. Let me make note here because a lot of people quote this, a lot of BHIs quote this to try to prove that there were black Jews, and I understand why you're doing it. But the message he was trying to give here was a disparaging message. All right, so let's go. Let's continue reading on 172. So we can also briefly consider the well-known and much quoted statement the following year, 1863, the anti-Semitic German philosopher Bruno Bauer. It says, the Jews is a white Negro, but the robust nature and the capacity for physical work of the Negro are missing and are replaced by a brain which by the size and activity bring the Jew close to the Caucasian peoples. On one level, this indicates non-Semitic connection between Jews and Negroes, but at the same time, for the atheist materialist Bauer, the ugly and alien religion of the Jews was created in the first place by the Jews' physical and physiological nature. Like African slaves, Jews could theoretically be shipped off to distant land. Bauer proposed the land of Canaan. Beyond their shared physical traits, they also shared a tendency to the primitive and to barbarism. In the previous century, the German Enlightenment, the Jews enjoyed a special status as primitives in terms of aesthetic sensibilities and the nature of their beliefs, and it was this primitive nature that formed one of the basic links between Jews and blacks. The usual perception of anti-black prejudice and hatred on the one hand, the anti-Semitism on the other, is that they were practiced by different people in different places for different reasons and at different times. However, we have seen that hatred of blacks is more likely than not to accompany hatred of Jews, and that the construct of black/Jew, the two hatreds were intertwined. By way of example, one would not automatically think that the viscerally anti-black theologian, polygynist, and polemist Jason Darrow would have had much room in his wizened heart for much anti-Semitism. He lived in the virtually Jew-free slave state of Kentucky, where 25% of the population at the time was African American. In his 1846 work, The New Light, or Discourse on the Christian Church on the Evils of Sectarianism, on the True Manner of Becoming Christians, Darrow devoted himself to the vilification of blacks. He proposed repellent views about African monstrosity and the coupling of Negroes with Pongos and other primates, countering the monogenous idea that blackness was the result of climate determinism. Darrow wrote, "There is another cause for black skin: the woolly head, the flat nose, the thick lip, the inverted chin, and disagreeable feeder. I can think of no reasonable cause but the degeneracy of the blood by bestiality. It is not for me to say with positive certainty with what species of animal this unnatural intercourse first existed. I will indeed affirm that it was only with one species, for it may have been with several, but I will affirm my conviction that it was with some animal that approached very near former size of the human race, of which there are several varieties in various countries whence the Negroes come and where they are indigenous. It is for unreasonable to suppose that in former times, in that warm country where passions are known to be strong and uncontrollable, the human race in some instances mingled with the orangutans, baboons, or other similar African animals, approximating very nearly to the size and figure of man. This, I believe, is the source of the deprivation of human blood in the Negro tribe, of the fearful dissimilarity in form and color, which obtains between purely human persons and those degraded Africans who have been imported into our midst. Those almost semi-human African animals, as I am compelled to suppose, the wild men of the woods or orangutans, in relation to the human race have formed a weak, inferior kingdom, but there is no mutual cleaving together of the two different natures, what two things are further apart than a white man and a Negro. Again, these are the type of people that existed to this time. The ideologues, these were the statements these guys was making. And that's why I caution a lot of Black Hebrew Israelites and my audience that's watching, stop, invoking these points, because you're sounding like you're the children, the spiritual children of these races, like Daryl here, that is saying all these disparaging things about Black people, saying that they slept with orangutans and produced an inferior race known as Africans. You understand? So when you guys invoke these weird beast of the field arguments, I get these vibes. This is where you draw your energy from. And as To the Prophet is eloquently putting this out, that with the same tropes you see in anti-Semitism is the same thing you see in anti-Black racism. It says here, Darrow finished in his diatribe with the frank acknowledgement of the sexual relations between masters and slaves, which were an important part of the life of the slave states. The colonial desire for the Black woman and the colonial fear of the Black man formed two of the most obvious pillars of white experience of Black Americans. What a gulf of chasm between them. Darrow lamented, and yet strange to say, what an attraction is by the vices of men established between them. Forever repelling, yet forever mingling, forever two, yet striving to be one. A couple pages later, Darrow turned to his venom on the Jews, whom he firmly inserted into the same bestial and monstrous category as Negroes. Voltaire, the witty French philosopher, spoke of the Jews anciently guilty of bestiality, and indeed as the only people who had laws against this unnatural crime. It is still uncertain, wrote Voltaire, whether any monsters were produced by this unnatural copulation, and whether there is any foundation in ancient stories of the fauns, satyrs, centaurs, and minotaurs. History says there were, but natural philosophy has not yet cleared up the monsters' account. The colonial desire and fear that was attached to Blacks was also attached to Jews. Darrow thought that some of the more depraved of the Jews in ancient times had practiced buggery with goats and other animals. This clearly could not fail to confuse and corrupt human blood, and as a result, these practices among Jews and Blacks monsters certainly often resulted. The Jews carrying in his blood traces of libidinous goat was as much to fear as the Negro. Jews and Negroes both had monstrous origins, following distant coupling with animals, and could not be considered fully human. Fully human, man. I hope y'all paying attention. I hope I'm not losing y'all, man. Y'all almost done. Man, I gotta highlight that one. Dr. Arthur Talmadge Abernethy, a Rutherford College, North Carolina, another former slave state, thought along the same lines. Abernethy was a well-educated man, a Methodist pastor, journalist, poet, and theologian. Author of some 50 books and pamphlets. In 1938, he was nominated by the U.S. President Franklin D. Roosevelt, an American ambassador of sunshine, and was elected to the American Association of Advancement of Science. Abernethy too argued that Jews were of Negro origin. His 1910 ethnographic work, proclaimed the Literary Digest as the most startling book of the year, was entitled The Jew, a Negro, being a study of the Jewish ancestry from an impartial standpoint. Abernethy argued that the Jew of today, as well as his ancestors at other times, is the kinsman and descendant of the Negro. So anytime you guys hear that book was made by this Democrat. It says here, difficult. Abernethy admitted that it will be difficult for the Jews today to recognize their less cultured African brother whose skin and his racial dependency and long years of uninterrupted repose under the denigrating climatic conditions of Africa has retained its ebony hue, and whose mind has not yielded so readily to the enlivening processes of the sharp practices of trade. Nonetheless, he continued the gradations of ethnical culture, intermarriage, migration, and intimacies with Caucasian races have elevated the Jewish people to a condition where they control vast commercial enterprises, possess some social prominence, but for their retained brunetteness, in many respects resemble the Caucasians. Yet thousands of years of effort to throw off their negrescence have failed to eradicate those race characteristics. And the Jew of today is essentially Negro in habits, physical peculiarities, and tendencies. The Jews who have migrated in modern times into African and other Negro countries have quickly drifted back into the habits and conduct of the uncivilized Negro races surrounding them. This is Abernathy. This is somebody FDR approved. This is how he's talking. FDR approved. You know, great Democrat, savior, president, highly progressive. The man was pretty much a fucking dictator. Excuse my language. And that's your Democratic legacy here. Uncivilized. Anyway, let's keep reading. In other words, Abernathy argued that Jews were both a Mongol race which had been molded by centuries of intermarriage with Europeans and also purely African. They were annoyingly white, but at the same time they were black. Their negrescence was fundamental. Their attempts to throw off their Negro characteristics were bound to fail. Once they moved back to Africa, they were revealed for what they were, a purely African race. We do not know the identity of those Jews who had migrated to modern times into Africa and other Negro countries, but it's likely that the much-discussed black Jews of Luongo were in his mind. For Abernathy, Jews were moreover full of bestial and monstrous traits, including sexual depravity, which were derived from their Negro ancestors in the jungles of Africa. Negroid interracial sexual transgression and exuberance were also attributed to Jews. Their pitiable disregard, especially among the men, for the finer conventionalities of social life, as well as for the regularities restricting sexual indulgences, has become a byword. The Jews, like the Negroes, whom this mania often drives to crimes against womanhood, are equally abnormally full-blooded. The construction of a depraved monster image of the black/Jew in the race factories of the 19th century foreshadowed the years of racial lunacy that would soon engulf Europe. The historian Claudia Brun perceived the racialization of the Jew, particularly in Germany in the second half of the 19th century, almost as a byproduct of Germany's growing involvement in its African colonies. European Jews became, so to speak, analogous to African colonial subjects. There is no doubt something to this argument, and as we have seen elsewhere, this vision of the Jews has something of a history in German-speaking lands. However, the development of black/Jew has a long history both in the United States and various European countries. Was a major product of anthropological writing of the 18th and 19th century. It started to gather force in the middle of the 19th century, some decades before Germany's African adventures began. Nonetheless, Bruns expressed the result of the development of the black/Jew as symbolic of the system of racial hierarchy very clearly. The complex shift toward racial anti-Semitism was condensed in the figure of the black Jew, which also stood for a system of racial hierarchy itself. Hey, Bruce says, Abernathy sounds like a BHI. Exactly. Annoyingly white. Oh, they're white. It was an issue because he didn't want to share the same skin color as these Jews. They despise these Jews, right? And you know, BHI said, "Oh, you're saying I'm a brother to these people over here? Yeah, you share. If you have an E clade, you share common ancestry, and your R clade puts you with Western Europeans as well, because they got R clades, and you got West European Jews with those R clades. So the arguments is silly." But let's read this again, because again, we want to understand the history of anti-Semitism. When you start studying the history of anti-Semitism, you see a lot of analogs between black racism and anti-Semitism. Why? Because many of these Germans that were coming to the Americas, they were learning how to be anti-Semites from the racism that they saw and experienced imposed on African Americans. That's where it comes from. Right? So you can't speak about anti-Semitism without invoking black anti-racism. Anti-black racism. This is why this quote's here. It says, the complex shift toward racial anti-Semitism was condensed in the figure of the black Jew, which also stood for the system of racial hierarchy itself. It's the same concept. That's why I kept saying and repeating throughout this video, you guys want to have friction towards certain people groups. The friction shouldn't be toward people groups. It should be toward the ideologues and ideologies that are pushing racism and anti-Semitism, because they're tied and intertwined. All right? The racial confusion embodied in this figure straddled the Atlantic and would soon be applied as legislation in much of Europe. Identical views about monstrous and sexually predatory Jews and monstrous and sexually predatory blacks, implicit in the figure of the black/Jew, would now be expressed in ever more murderous form in the Nazi ravagings as Europe descended into what refugees from the European cauldron called race madness. And I believe that we're still in the period of race madness, because all these ideologues, these groups, the BHIs, pro-blacks, the ADLs, the Jewish, these non-denominational Jews on social media like Clubhouse, a lot of you guys are married with these racial hierarchical systems and ideologies. A lot of you guys have spewed some of the things we read tonight about Negroes and other people. This is where it comes from. So we must fight and challenge and eradicate these things, and notice what we're trying to eradicate. A lot of you guys just want to have a discussion about white versus black versus white. We have to tackle these ideologues. And how do we tackle it? Through teaching people what these things are. You don't even know what they are. You haven't studied them. We have to bring the axe to the trunk of the tree, the root of the tree, and get rid of this way of thinking. And it starts by properly educating the people. All right. So it's getting late. I did want to read one more thing. So that was that chapter in Hybrid Hate. As you can see, those two concepts are intertwined, and anti-Semitism coming after what we see with anti-black racism, being inspired by anti-black racism. All right. So that's the end of that. I'm debating in my head, should I go ahead and read this? Because I've already read it, but I want to reiterate it since we're dealing with anti-Semitism. So I'll leave it for another time. We out of here. I hope y'all learned something, man. Remember to use your noggin. Don't invoke these racist ideologies. Leave them in the past. We out. Peace to everybody. Shalom. Read more. The pro-literacy here.
Make a slap trip.
I be doing shit these niggas wouldn't understand. Stop playing with that man. Where was niggas at when I ran through 200 bands? Stop playing with that man. Where was niggas at when they was trying to get a chair? Stop playing with that man. Where was niggas at when Walton wasn't playing fair? Yeah, stop playing with that man. Stop. Yeah, stop playing with that man. Stop it. Nigga, stop playing with that man. Shit, nigga. Stop playing with that man. Shit, nigga. Yeah, stop playing with that man. Nigga, we ain't playing around. Karate chop, nigga, that's gonna lay him down. I got it from my sensei. A Ku Klux, so I bought me 10Ks. My shooter got me, I made sure his rent paid. A grimy nigga, but he don't wear 10K. He wears a Vinci, he don't even fit J's. A sharpshooter, you should see him switchblade. I be doing shit these niggas wouldn't understand. Stop playing with that man. Where was niggas at when I ran through 200 bands? Stop playing with that man. Where was niggas at when they was trying to get a chair? Stop playing with that man. Where was niggas at when Walton wasn't playing fair? Yeah, stop playing with that man. Stop. Yeah, stop that man. Stop it, stop it, nigga. Stop playing with that man. Shit, nigga. Stop playing with that man. Shit, nigga. Yeah, stop playing with that man. Add me on Twitter, that's gonna get you in the jam. Stop playing with that man. 223 shells and knock a nigga out his frame. Stop playing with that man. Ever been indicted? I ain't see you in that jam. Yeah, stop playing with that man. Niggas acting like fans. Some shit I never understand. Is you gangster or not? That's for Instagram, you don't hang on the block. This a Hunt Diddy, I don't hang with no stocks. You a brand lover, bitch, you bang with the ops. You like felons, cause I came with a lot. A tough cookie put his brains in a knot. How much I pay for these chains, it's a lot. Stop talking money if you really don't got it. I be doing shit these niggas wouldn't understand. Stop playing with that man. Where was niggas at when I ran through 200 bands? Stop playing with that man. Where was niggas at when they was trying to get a chair? Stop playing with that man. Where was niggas at when Walton wasn't playing fair? Yeah, stop playing with that man. Stop, stop, yeah, stop playing with that man. Stop it, stop it, nigga. Stop playing with that man. Shit, nigga. Stop playing with that man. Shit, nigga. Yeah, stop playing with that man. Stop playing with that man. Nigga already know what the deal is, nigga. Yeah, I should already know by now. Don't play with him. We're not the ones to play with. What is money? Don't make us throw it up in the air and walk away. Put a price on your head on a sticky pad. Stop playing.